One day when my daughter was in second grade, she came up to me and said, "Dad, I'm ready for my TV." I'm like, what? And according to her, we had a conversation when she was in kindergarten where she informed me that she wanted a TV for her room. And she said that I told her, "Honey, you can have a TV when you can pay for it." I mean, I really didn't want her to have a TV in her room, but I figured that might, that you can have one when you can pay for it. And so that day in second grade, when she said it was time for TV, she said, "I think I got the money." And she had a little Hello Kitty purse, and she opened it up. It was like, purse was about this big with a long strap. She took it off her shoulder, opened it up, and it was like loaded with, she could barely shut it, loaded with cash. And unbeknownst to me, she had, from that day in kindergarten when we had the alleged conversation about the TV, she had saved every bit of money that came her way. Wow. Her small allowance, birthday money, at like special days like Halloween or Valentine's, aunts and uncles would send $10 here, $10 there. She saved it all. And so we counted it out. And she not only had enough for a TV, she had enough for a VCR too. And I thought, I must have said this because she doesn't forget stuff. So we went to Best Buy, we got the TV, we got the VCR, and came home, set it up on the dresser at the end of her bed, and I this vivid memory of her lying in bed with her stuffed animals propped up on her pillow with her remote control in hand, and it was one of this look of sheer contentment, utter bliss that I will never forget. Later on, she tried that same ploy with getting a dog, and I was more careful about how I answered that. I was more vague. We eventually got a dog, but I didn't commit to a timetable. Anyway, the point of that story was that it was a story. If I just got up there and told you that when my daughter was a child, she was a precocious and determined child, that would have gone in one ear and out the other. But telling a story, you'll remember that now. Because stories are how we process the world. It's how we make sense of the world. Stories are what we remember. We crave stories. Anyone here a Breaking Bad fan?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man. I was, totally into that show. I thought it was the best thing since The Wire. I loved it. And when the final episode aired not too long ago, I remember watching that final episode and I just wanted to savor if I could have watched it in slow motion just to extend the pleasure. And then when the show was over, just felt this kind of gaping hole in my heart. It's done, and what am I going to do now? Apparently other people felt the emptiness too. Tourists in Albuquerque are still taking selfies in front of the Walter White House, much to the annoyance of the owners of the home. That's going to go on forever. So for me, the emptiness lingered until I discovered Game of Thrones. Amazing! And there's Mad Men, and there's Orange is the New Black, and there's House of Cards, and all this. And when I was a kid, I loved the Batman TV. You remember the Batman? This is really old. The Batman TV series, the campy one starring Adam West. When they got into fights, it was Pal and Wham and all that. But when I was really little, that show in Baltimore came on every Thursday afternoon, once a week. Back in the day, if you missed it, you were out of luck until the next week. So now we have, as you well know, this magical thing called On Demand. And I've watched almost the entire first 3 seasons of Game of Thrones in just a few weeks. And I mean, what is this? A world where we can just watch anything we want anytime we want. This is like the Emerald City. This is an allusion to another narrative, right? On demand, Netflix, iPads. Humans have created advanced technologies to feed prehistoric impulses. And I wonder if our kind of primal need for narrative has indeed been a driving force behind the technological revolution. Because when you think about it, it's all about telling more stories, telling better stories, having stories all the time, not just once a week on Thursday afternoon. So clearly something this pervasive, this universal, must have deep roots in our species. And indeed, it appears that narrative, stories have played this kind of formative role in our evolution. I want to quote from an interesting little book called Wired for Story. It was one of these random finds at half price, called Wired for Story. And the author wrote, "Opposable thumbs let us hang on. Story told us what to hang on to. Story is what enabled us to imagine what might happen in the future and so prepare for it, a feat no other species can lay claim to, opposable thumbs or not. Story is what makes us human, not just metaphorically, but literally." And I mean, we can unpack that, we can talk about it, because I'm not so sure that what we are doing in story and narrative is maybe all that different from, I mean, who knows what whales are telling each other, so I don't want to make it like this huge distinction between us and animals on the story front, but it seems,
You should see the one that got away.
Yeah, right. So we're starting to learn more about the connection between neuroscience and narrative. So it does seem that our brains are hardwired to respond to stories. A recent brain imaging study reported in the journal Psychological Science reveals that regions of the brain that process the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and movements of real life are the same ones that are activated when we're engrossed in a compelling narrative. And a good story can also give us a dopamine rush. Which is, did you ever think about the irony of being addicted to Breaking Bad? A show about, this incredibly addictive substance, Narrative can even rewire our brains. Some studies have suggested that good narratives can make us more empathetic people. Young people who are exposed to good literature develop better social skills. All kinds of neat research being done. Of course, every good communicator knows this intuitively, right? I mean, even think about television commercials. Like, the good television commercials are essentially a very, very, very short story told in 1 minute or even 30 seconds. One of the best political communicators of modern times was Ronald Reagan. First time Reagan ran for president, he famously told this story of a woman who, when she went to the welfare office to get her food stamps, she drove up in her what? Cadillac. And you still remember that. On an aside, I was wondering about this. Have you noticed anytime something bad happens in the news involving a luxury vehicle, they mention the brand name of the luxury vehicle? Like, remember the woman who ran over her husband repeatedly, enraged in her Mercedes? Or let's say something like Attorney Rex Lexus on Allen Parkway or something like that. They would never say, and they still, when that story gets repeated today, they still mention the Mercedes. The media would never say she ran over him repeatedly in her Volvo. Well, yeah, Volvo's made, but like Honda or Chevy.
Or
Pinto, right? They wouldn't say that. Just watch. I want to see if other people have noticed that too, but I digress. I think I was talking about Reagan. Oh yeah, Reagan. It turns out that the story he told never even happened. It was all made up. But the story of the Cadillac driving welfare queen took root. It became a cultural meme. Some of us still remember it today. It tapped into resentment about supposed welfare abuse. It tapped into racism. It was brilliant. It was brilliant in a dark way, but brilliant nonetheless. And that's the kind of power that stories have for us. Once you hear a memorable story, good or bad, true or false, it will not leave your head. The other night, as I was writing these very words, I was sitting on the front porch of my house, and a couple of women were taking their evening stroll around the neighborhood. They were doing laps around the block. And they were talking rather loudly, and the night was still, so you could kind of eavesdrop on what they were talking about. And on one lap, as I was working on my message here, I heard one of the women say to the other, it was just like when Jesus was on the road to Emmaus talking to his disciples and they didn't recognize him. And that's all I heard of that, and then they walked on. But what struck me was that, and also, if you don't know, the road to Emmaus was one of the famous post-Easter resurrection stories. And it just struck me that this woman was demonstrating kind of the point I was trying to make in this talk is that she was viewing some aspect of life through the lens of this biblical story. Probably not a coincidence that this was an Easter story, because Easter's just a few weeks ago. They probably heard the story at church or something. But, and look, Easter, most likely didn't happen. But the narrative still retains its power, and people are still talking about it on their walks in suburban America more than 2,000 years later, simply because it's a really good story. And as free thinkers, we may not like the implications, we may not like, never mind the fact that, there are holes in the story, that the gospel accounts can't even agree on the basic facts of what happened on Easter. It's a darn good story. And as an aside, actually, I think both Christmas and Easter are case studies for kind of how narrative develops. Because what we think of as the Christmas story or what we think of as the Easter story are conflations of different accounts in the New Testament. On their own, the individual birth narratives or resurrection narratives in the Gospels are too flimsy, are really not that great to have any real lasting power. And so, Western culture developed this kind of Christmas story that was a conflation, and this kind of idealized Easter story, what happened, brought the various elements together from different biblical stories, and then embellished them over the years, adding things that weren't even in the text to make the stories better. I think some Americans would be surprised to find out there was not a little drummer boy at the manger, and this notion that the three magi were actually kings. You look at the nativity set, they got crowns on. Doesn't say they were kings. It says one of them was black. His name was Balthazar. No, these stories came together and got embellished and grew to become better stories, more memorable stories. Because on their own, they would have. I don't think it would have had the impact that they had. So the lesson is, I believe, for us, is that we secularists need to wake up to the power of story. Secularism will not prevail until we get better stories. We can debunk Easter and the Bible and Islam and Mormonism all we want, but with humans it's never just about the facts. Life isn't Dragnet. Remember Sergeant Joe Friday? Just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts. The people with the better story prevail. Ronald Reagan could tell stories, Jimmy Carter couldn't. John F. Kennedy could be witty and spontaneously humorous and relaxed, Richard Nixon couldn't. End of story. Being likable matters, telling good narratives matter. We might wish it were otherwise, but to wish that would be wishful thinking. And we can be capable of wishful thinking too. We pride ourselves on our reliance on reason, and reason is essential. Do not get me wrong. I'm not asking that we jettison our commitment to rational thought and empiricism. Absolutely not. But you can be reasonable and tell a good story at the same time. The two are not mutually exclusive. We already have great examples. Carl Sagan, Michio Kaku, Brandon Baldwin, I thought that was pretty darn good. Kurt Vonnegut, Neil deGrasse Tyson. These are all, except for Kurt Vonnegut, these are brilliant scientists. I'm trying to keep it in the science realm, but anyway, these are brilliant scientists who know how to connect with the average person and engage them at an emotional level. Tyson's Cosmos is filled with great narrative. Have you heard of the Moth Radio Hour? Yeah, it's incredible. I don't know why I was so late stumbling on this. It's a radio show on NPR out of New York. You can hear it here on, of course you can get it online. It's put on by an award-winning nonprofit group dedicated to the art of storytelling. And the show's format is very simple. Three individuals get up and tell stories about their life. It's just each episode just features three stories from three individuals in front of a live audience. And they're just stories about their lives. Some of the people on the Moth radio hour are famous. Most are not. Most are just ordinary people telling stories of their lives. No agendas, no axes to grind, just stories about people, about life, and about our common humanity. A few weeks ago, I heard one that really touched me, and I wanted to share part of it with you. There's not time for the whole thing, but just want to share the closing part. This is a story told by a flight attendant named Faye Lane, and she just told this, kind of the story of how she became a flight attendant, what it's like to work in the field, and you can hear her whole talk and access it at themoth.org. But Faye Lane closed her episode, or a portion of the episode, with this kind of mini story. And she said she was working a flight in late September of 2001. And a passenger came on carrying a garbage bag, which is, And she said that's one of the pet peeves of stewardesses, is people bring, it's like, can't you get a $15, suitcase or something? But no, he came on with this big garbage bag. He went to his assigned row, put the garbage bag in the overhead bin, and then she said he closed the bin and stood there with his hand on it, and he stood in the aisle. And that was also kind of a pet peeve, and she felt like she wanted to tell him to sit down. He was looking a little strange, and she said she was really everybody was on edge so soon after 9/11, so she was keeping an eye on this guy. And later on in the flight, when he got up to wait at the restroom while the seatbelt light was still on. And she asked him to sit down. He said, look, the seatbelt light is on for a reason. He's like, I know, but I really have to go. So he's just standing there waiting for the restroom right next to her. She's sitting in her jump seat. And she felt like she just needed to make a little conversation. So she said, oh, are you traveling for business or pleasure? And he said, neither. He said that he lived in California, but came to New York because his son was a first responder at Ground Zero, and he died there. And he said, I came to pick up his uniform, which is all I have of him, and it's in a bag in the overhead bin. And I'm going to quote the flight attendant. She said, and then I remembered why I was there and why I wanted that job. Because everybody has a story. And I don't know what that story is. People fly for a reason, maybe going to a funeral, maybe going to see a sick relative, or for something joyful, like a wedding. I don't know what that story is, but for that little piece of time, I am a part of it, and I have an impact on their experience. I loved those words. They struck me as profoundly humanistic. And are they not a description of life itself? Thinking of, it's like life is this journey, and we're thrown together. We don't know, you don't know my story, I don't know your story, but we can have an impact on each other's experience. Because what is life if not a journey that we share with others? And that got me thinking, maybe helping people tell their stories is something we should also be about here in a humanist community. Maybe we at Oasis from time to time should have our own, not all the time, but every once in a while, we'll do a Moth Sunday. And we'll still have our musician, but instead of having a main speaker, we'll have 3 people that get up and tell stories like that. Just, like I said, no axes to grind, no agendas to push, just stories of our common humanity. I think it might be fun to try out. And, a gathering of free thinkers and humanists does not always need to be about, promoting the glories of reason and science and empiricism. Sometimes it's enough just to celebrate the human experience. And nothing is more human than telling a good story. How are we doing? Oh, okay, that's it. Thanks.